Look, before we get into this video, I just want to note that obviously I'm really white.
Okay, Riley, but what effects will this have on the content of this video? Unlike you and many of your far-left SJW cronies, I am not a racist, and I do not care about your skin color. It bears virtually no effect on the contents of this video.
And when I talk about white people, I don't mean it in a those white people kind of way, like I'm somehow detached from that. When I say white people, I mean myself included. I just don't want it to come across as like, I'm one of the good ones, because I'm still learning how to combat racism and white supremacy myself.
Do you have a lot to learn or what? I hold it quite racist to believe that you somehow have privilege over black people just for being white. Not only is it insulting to underprivileged white people, such as the lower class, the mentally ill, and convicts, but it is also insulting to black people to assume that they are oppressed just for being black. Not all black people are poor or underprivileged, unlike what you may believe, Riley. Just because more of them are underprivileged than the average white person, it does not mean all of them are that way.
Anyway, the point of this video is that not all white people bullshit. If you don't know what I mean, let me give you an example. Let's say a person of color experiences some kind of racism from a white person. In frustration, they say, white people are horrible. At this point, you can expect some kind of white person to pop up out of the bushes and scream, not all white people, you shouldn't generalize us like that. That's reverse racism.
First of all, there's no such thing as reverse racism. It simply just doesn't exist. If someone discriminates against a white person for being white, they are racist, not a reverse racist. Second of all, in the hypothetical situation that you just proposed, I don't understand what is so offensive about saying not all white people. Yes, not all white people, Riley. Not all white people discriminate against black people. Some of them do, while others do not. It is promoting negative stereotypes against white people when someone calls them all racist. It's simply not true. Besides, white people aren't the only race that discriminate against black people. In many poor, non-white countries such as China or India, black people often face actual discrimination. It is very racist and flat out wrong to claim that white people are the only ones who can be racist.
These white people, the ones who constantly scream, not all white people, and reverse racism, argue that making a generalization about white people is just as bad as making a generalization about people of color. They think that saying white people are horrible is just as bad as saying black people are horrible.
Well, because it is. White people are not worth any more or any less than black people simply because they lack melanin in their skin.
On like a total surface level, you might think, yeah, that makes sense. Those statements are both generalizations about a race.
Exactly.
But if you look just a little bit harder at the cultural, social, political, and historical context that these phrases are set in, it's pretty easy to see that they are not equivalent statements. I mean, black people in the US were slaves, and then they were considered 3/5 of a person, and then they lived under Jim Crow segregation laws, and even today they still experience systemic racism on a daily basis.
Well, all of that was very awful, Riley, and I think most of us can agree that it is very bad. Black people in the modern U.S. generally do not face oppression simply for being black. Yes, modern black people are often discriminated against, but it is usually not simply because they're black. It is usually because they're poor or from a rough neighborhood, and while these things are often correlated with blackness, it is not blackness. Not all black people are poor or from the hood. And white people can be poor and grow up in an inner city area as well.
The prejudice and discrimination that was built into our institutions and systems didn't go away overnight with the Civil Rights Act of 1965. Racism, and by extension white supremacy, both still have a deep hold on this country. To be a person of color in the US today means to live under a system that was not only not built for you, but was built to harm you. If you don't believe that people of color are marginalized and oppressed in a way that white people are not, you're just being willfully ignorant at this point.
No, Riley, I'm not being willfully ignorant. Unlike you, who are basically making claims that people of color are systematically oppressed. Because it makes you feel like a mighty whitey who is standing up for those poor, marginalized colored people. I know that is what this is about. Do not pretend otherwise.
So I'm gonna assume that we can all agree on this. If we can't agree, I don't think I'm gonna be able to convince you, but there will be some links in the description if you'd like to challenge your worldview with some facts and statistics.
Okay, so I checked out a few of the links that Riley left in the description of her video. Not all from websites I've heard of, by the way, but the ones that I've heard of, such as ABC News and USA Today, are known sources of fake news that the American public somehow still trusts. Anyway, the articles that Riley linked to just aren't convincing to me. I'm sorry, Riley. Just like I mentioned earlier, even if black people or someone of another race is discriminated against, it isn't usually because of their race, but their class. It isn't racism, but classism. It just looks like racism because the people discriminated against are often black. To illustrate my point even further, it isn't common to hear about those of Asian descent being discriminated against in the U.S. simply for being Asian. Why is this? It is because Asian households have a higher median income than black households, Hispanic households, and even white households. Riley, if you actually want to attack injustice in the world, fight against classism, not racism. Classism is a far more prominent problem in society today, and while it has always been a problem, it is just accentuated because other forms of discrimination have been done away with on a larger scale.
Anyway, the point of all of this is just to give you some background for why generalizing statements about white people versus generalizing statements about black people are not equivalent. They don't exist in a vacuum. Black people in the US have been oppressed and continue to be oppressed in ways that white people will never fully be able to understand.
I call BS, Riley. White people can be discriminated against too, and it has happened before. White people are not immune to discrimination simply because of the color of their skin.
So when you say something in 2017, knowing everything that has happened up until now, your words live in the context of this time period, in this culture, in this political context. They can't be separated from that. So let's say you're a white person and you say, black people are horrible. In a greater context, you are a member of a group that oppressed black people for a long time and continues to do so today.
Just because some white people in the past and some white people today still discriminate against black people, it does not mean all white people are responsible for the actions of others. A white person is an individual, just like someone else of another race, and is only responsible for their own actions, not the actions of another, even if they do happen to share the same skin color.
I can already hear the white people chiming in saying that they weren't alive during slavery, so they shouldn't be responsible for it.
That is absolutely correct. White people alive today are not responsible for slavery.
And sure, you're not directly responsible for slavery, but you continue to benefit from the oppression of black people, which has had its roots in slavery. That's a fact.
I don't know how a white person still alive today would benefit from slavery, but even if they were, for the sake of argument, that wouldn't make them responsible unless they were directly involved with it. No white person alive today is responsible for slavery simply because it wasn't around when they existed.
And I know white people get really sensitive about this, and I get it. I used to be in middle school too.
Burn.
And I wanted to believe that I lived in a system that was fair and equal and didn't value me over someone else just because of the color of my skin. But then I grew up and I realized that racism was still very much alive. So I'm not saying that white people need to hate themselves or have guilt over this. I just think we need to recognize our role as people who have benefited from racism and who are a part of a group that has oppressed and continues to oppress black people.
How is that any different from having white guilt, though? And as mentioned earlier, just because some white people discriminate against black people, it doesn't make all white people responsible.
And then we need to work to fight against that. And part of what that means is that when you, as a white person, say black people are horrible, your words are just perpetuating the oppression of black people that white people have been doing for a long time. You're continuing that racist cycle. You're adding fuel to the fire. On the other hand, if a black person says white people are horrible, it doesn't have that weight behind it. The power dynamics are completely different. It doesn't perpetuate systemic racism. It doesn't result in the institutional oppression of white people. It's just an expression of anger against an oppressor group. That's all there is to it.
White people are not an oppressor group. That is a very racist thing to say. The ironic thing is that even though this video is supposed to combat racism, Riley is effectively doing the opposite. She is saying that all white people are racist and evil and hate black people simply because of the color of their skin. Now that, Riley, is truly racist.
Two statements don't carry the same weight or historical context. For centuries, white people insulting black people has led to their enslavement, disenfranchisement, and oppression.
If by insulting you mean simply throwing the quote-unquote N-word around irresponsibly and saying mean words to them, that didn't lead to their oppression. I highly suggest opening a history book before making such a bold claim.
Meanwhile, black people insulting white people hasn't had anywhere near the same impact on white people. They're just on completely different levels.
Are you saying that black people have more sensitive feelings than white people do? If that is the case, Riley, and I hope it isn't, you are being unintentionally racist right now.
And it's painfully simplistic to avoid all social, political, cultural, and historical context just to make these statements seem comparable. The best analogy I can think of to demonstrate this kind of power dynamic in a really simple way is this. Imagine there's a queen and a peasant. Obviously, the queen has a lot of power and the peasant does not have a lot of power. Now, the peasant can point at the queen and say, "Throw her in jail," and it won't have any effect. The guards aren't going to listen to a peasant. But if the queen points to the peasant and says, "Throw her in jail," then the guards will listen and the peasant will end up in jail. Both parties said the same phrase directed towards the other one, but one of those phrases had a lot more power because of the context.
I don't understand Riley's analogy. Is she saying that black people are poor, powerless peasants and white people are evil tyrants? If that is the case, then Riley has inadvertently said another racist thing. Besides, a rude racial remark is not nearly on the same level as throwing someone in jail. What happened to sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. I agree that people shouldn't make disparaging remarks based on race, but at the end of the day, it's just words. Grow up.
Reverse racism isn't a thing.
That's right, it's called racism.
Because systemic racism hurts and oppresses people of color, not white people. While people can certainly be rude or prejudiced towards white people, that still doesn't mean that white people face systemic oppression in anywhere near the same way that people of color do.
White people can be discriminated against too, and even for the sake of argument, it doesn't happen to white people as much as it happens to people of color. It's still racism, regardless of how much it happens or whether or not they suffer from systematic oppression.
Okay, so context matters when it comes to generalizations, but also when white people say not all white people, they're usually taking a complaint about racism and making it about themselves. The only time I've heard generalizations from people of color about white people has been after a person of color has experienced some kind of racism.
Just because someone is discriminated against by a white person, it still doesn't make it okay to blame all white people. Two wrongs do not make a right.
So, for example, let's say a person of color on Twitter tweets something about systemic racism. In response, they get a bunch of ignorant white people replying and calling them racial slurs and saying that racism doesn't exist and all of that. In response, they say something to the effect of, "I am so tired of white people. They're horrible." And that's when the not all white people crowd comes in. Some white person pops up and says, "Not all white people are like that. I'm one of the good ones." In this way, all that saying not all white people does is absolve that white person of any guilt and make the situation about them.
Just because a white person or any other person says not all white people, it doesn't mean that they are trying to absolve themselves from white guilt. They are simply stating an obvious fact, that not all white people are racist. But part of this is so hard to understand.
Why do you have a need to insert yourself there and defend yourself? It doesn't make the situation any better. It doesn't get rid of the racist nonsense that that person has had to endure, and it doesn't challenge it either.
Again, they may not be defending themselves. They're simply pointing out that not all white people are racist, and it is racist to say such a thing.
It's just a very indifferent, "Don't worry, we're not all like that," which isn't too reassuring, I'd imagine, since that doesn't negate all the racism that person gets.
Just because someone receives a lot of racist bullshit, it does not give them the right to be racist in return.
I understand that you want to defend yourself and you feel like when someone makes a comment about white people that it affects you. But the truth of the matter is that you're going to be just fine. Generalizations about white people are not going to hurt you. They're not going to contribute to unfair housing discrimination against you or lead to a racial hiring bias against you because you're white.
While it is true that one negative racial comment probably won't have a significant effect on the life of a white person, if you have your way, Riley, and this anti-white sentiment spreads, it is very likely that white people will have to face at least some degree of racial discrimination in the future.
Unarmed black people are shot by police regularly because of the generalization that they're violent and dangerous.
That is generally untrue. The main reason why black people are more likely to be shot by the police is simply because they are more likely to have a weapon and be a threat to police. Again, because of an underprivileged, poor upbringing. Michael Brown and Philando Castile were not innocent victims. They were active threats to the police at the time of their shooting.
White people don't have a comparable generalization that affects them like that. There's no comparison.
What about being racist white cops? Doesn't that count?
So I get that your feelings as a white person might be a little hurt by generalization about you, but it's not going to result in any real-world systemic bias against you.
As mentioned earlier, If your anti-white attitude spreads, it very well could.
So stop trying to downplay the frustrations of people of color by saying not all white people. Just let it go. If you're a white person who's genuinely working towards anti-racism, then I don't think you would feel the need to assert not all white people at every chance you get, because you would know better than to center your own feelings in these discussions.
It is fighting racism to say not all white people. If someone is being genuinely racist against white people, it isn't always about their feelings. In this video, you have proved absolutely nothing, except you yourself, a white person, hate other white people, and that you have white guilt.